Chicago 10 movie review. So this is a review of the 2007 docudrama about the Chicago 10 trial, alternatively known as the Chicago 8 trial or the Chicago 7 trial. Just in case there's anybody out there who doesn't know what this is, I'm going to give some background, and if you're already familiar with this, you'll have to bear with me. But in 1968, at the Democratic National Convention, there was a big protest organized against the Democratic National Convention, mostly about the Vietnam War. And it broke down into mass chaos. There was considerable debate, probably still is considerable debate, about who was ultimately responsible for it. Whether it was the protesters who rioted or whether it was the police who just went nuts and started clubbing everybody. It's also been called a police riot as well as a riot. But regardless, afterwards, the government put on trial the organizers of the demonstration in Chicago, which amounted to 8 people, of which 6 of them were very famous at the time in counterculture. The other 2 guys aren't really famous, but the ones who were famous was Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panthers. Then there was Tom Hayden and Renee Davis, who were both prominent leaders in the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Tom Hayden probably the more famous of the 2, but Renee Davis was well known at the time. Then Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. Both Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman were founders of the Yippie Party, the Youth International Party, but they were best well known just for their pranks. They were kind of, well, what's the word? Guerrilla theater. The media loved them because they would always do eccentric things. Then there was David Dillinger, who was a little bit older than the rest of the defendants. He was a prominent member of the War Resisters League. And then the other 2 guys, like I said, were not particularly famous. I don't even remember their names offhand. So because this had been such a big event, the riots in Chicago, and because these guys were so particularly famous, the trial was a big media event. And it became an even bigger media event when, because these guys were so well connected to the counterculture and the New Left at the time, all sorts of celebrities associated with counterculture and the New Left were called on to the trial. So, you know, famous rock stars and singers like Country Joe from Country Joe and the Fish, or Arlo Guthrie, or Judy Collins. Famous writers, I think, like Norman Mailer, Jesse Jackson was there. Who else? Just like a list of very famous counterculture people at the time. So it was a huge media circus at the time. I think it was being called the trial of the century again at the time, although since then we've had other big media trials, we've had other big trials that have turned into media circuses that I think have eclipsed this one in recent memory, right? Now everybody calls O.J. Simpson the trial of the century. That's another tangent. So it was a huge deal at the time. Now, Bobby Seale at one point was demanding his own representation and was not satisfied with the representation he had, and ended up causing such a fuss that he ended up getting tried separately. And so then it became known as the Chicago 7, which is sometimes the more common name. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia article on this trial, Wikipedia article is entitled Chicago 7. But it started out as the Chicago 8, and Jerry Rubin, one of the defendants, was quoted as saying, you know, anyone who calls it the Chicago 7 and not the Chicago 8 is racist because they're forgetting about Bobby Seale. So he prefers it be called the Chicago 8. And then he added, and you've got to include our 2 lawyers, because there are 2 lawyers who were also indicted on contempt of court charges. All of the defendants and their lawyers ended up getting indicted on contempt of court charges just because of their attitude in the court. So Jerry Rubin prefers it be called the Chicago 10, and that's the title of this movie, even though it's much more commonly known as the Chicago 7 or the Chicago 8. So that's all by way of background. I was, in my youth, back in the days when I was quite interested in radical politics, very interested in this trial. I'm not old enough to have lived through it. I was born in 1978. But when I was in college, I took an active interest in it. The internet was in its infancy back then, but at my school library, college library, they had a big, thick book, which was a complete transcript of the Chicago 8 trial. And it was, I believe it was published as part of like the Great Trial series. So, like the Scopes trial, or what else? All these famous trials in American history. They published a transcript of them as books, and I'm not sure this is still in print now. It was hiding in the library somewhere, but you can probably track it down, and it's definitely available on the internet. I'll see if I can dig up a link to the transcript of the Chicago trial on the internet and link it down below. It's also been made into movies and plays multiple times. The ones I've seen, there was a 1987 HBO drama which was based right on the transcript, meaning I believe everything that was in the drama was verbatim from the transcript that was published. And this was a television movie, and this was back in 1987. So if you watch it nowadays, the production values do seem quite dated. I think the film quality is not great. It's what they used to film TV programs on back in those days. And it's all the way back from 1987. And yet, of all the representations of the trial I've seen, this one was my favorite. Just because I think the acting was quite good. Everything was verbatim from the transcript. And they stuck only to what happened in the trial. And didn't get bogged down with trying to explain the broader picture of what was going on in 1969. And that has pros and cons, obviously, but there was a lot of there was a lot of chaos that was just happening in the courtroom. So there's an advantage to narrowing your focus to just what's on the courtroom, which is, by the way, is going to be one of my criticisms of Chicago 10, because they did not do that. Well, it's got pros and cons. Anyways, it's available on YouTube. It's in like 4 different parts, but I'll link to part 1 down below. I'm not quite sure it's up legally there, but the version I was just looking up just now was posted in 2011. So if they're concerned about copyrights, they're moving quite slow on this one. It's survived now for 9 years on YouTube. It's probably fairly safe. So I'll link to it down below. If anyone's interested, I encourage you to watch that. Another version of this trial which I saw was the 2000 movie called Steal This Movie, which was a biopic about Abby Hoffman, again one of the defendants in this trial. And this was kind of his whole life. It wasn't just the Chicago trial, but the Chicago trial did feature prominently in the movie. It's also been featured in a number of movies which I have not seen. I think since Chicago 10 came out, there have been a couple more movies about this trial, which I haven't gotten a chance to track down. And this year, according to Wikipedia, 2020, there will be an Aaron Sorkin movie about the Chicago trial, which will be released in September or October. And that sounds really interesting. It'll be really interesting to see what Aaron Sorkin does with this material. But that's still upcoming, obviously. Okay, so all of that is by way of background. Now to talk about this movie specifically, the Chicago 10. It's an animated docudrama. And I know it seems a little bit strange that you would animate this. But once you start watching it, then it becomes clear once they decide to why did they decide to animate it. Because it allows them to mix the real archival footage with the recreations of what happened in the courtroom. So for what was happening in the courtroom, we have the transcript. I guess we have to trust that it's complete. But there were no cameras in the courtroom. So we just have the transcript and, the artist renderings of what was going on in the courtroom, right? Because, like they let the newspaper reporters draw pictures, but nobody could take video. So in order to recreate what was happening in the courtroom, they animated it. But then to go back to the actual footage of the 1968 riots and the speeches these guys were given, then they used the real archival footage. And obviously, if they had been using actors, then the archival footage in the image that they were using for the recreation scenes wouldn't match up, because you could say, wait, that's not Bobby Seale, that guy looks completely different. But if you animate it, then you could get a reasonable approximation of somebody who looks the same way, and it allows them to mix in the animation and the archival footage. It's interesting. I think it mostly works. And by my estimate, half the movie, or maybe more, is made up of archival footage. Now, because they're making use of the archival footage, the film is seeking not only to document what happened in the trial, it's also seeking to document the demonstrations at the Chicago Democratic National Convention and the resulting riots, and then the conspiracy trial. As such, I think this film does bite off more than it can comfortably chew. So again, remember I mentioned with that 1987 HBO movie, that movie was just based on the transcript for the trial, and they still had to cut out loads. I mean, if you go and look at the transcript for the trial, there were all sorts of interesting things that they didn't have time to do in the 1987 movie, and that was just based on what was in the trial. Here, they're just trying to fit everything in. Now, certainly you can understand the impulse to try and put these together. I mean, the story of one is not really complete without the other, especially now. Or especially when this movie came out in 2007. You've got this whole younger generation that's grown up. I'm an exception. I'm a history geek. But your average man out on the street is maybe not going to know this story. So you almost have to try and put them together to tell the whole story. I think the 1987 movie was different because it was 1987. And I think that movie, when it came out, was aimed at an adult audience that had lived through it, the baby boomers. This, it came out in 2007 and is aimed at a younger audience who doesn't remember it. So they're trying to put the whole story together. But it's just too much, and there's all sorts of gaps in the narrative. Or, I don't know, maybe it works. I think it works if you accept that the purpose of any sort of historical movie is not to give a thorough coverage of the topic. The purpose of a historical movie is just to give people an introduction to the topic so that they can go out and research it on their own. And if that's what you're trying to do, then I guess this movie does work. That being said, here are some of the gaps I noticed in the film. The entire film revolves around protesting the Vietnam War, and yet the film never includes any of the reasons why people would be against the war. Now, in 1968 or 1969, you didn't need to get into all of this. This was on the nightly news every night. People knew what was happening. Yeah, nowadays, maybe not so much. So for people who didn't grow up with this, some of the uglier details, like the carpet bombing of civilian populations, napalm being dropped on children, whole villages being massacred by U.S. soldiers, what was going on in My Lai and Quang Ngai and stuff like that. That's nasty stuff. And if you're watching this every night in the news and you know what's going on, then you can understand why there's such a strong passion at the time to protest this war. If you're watching this in 2007 or 2020, as the case may be, and you don't have this historical background, it's maybe a little bit difficult to understand why there's so much emotion going on here. And I know they're already trying to cram too much stuff into this 2-hour movie, but I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes kind of explaining the background about what was actually happening in Vietnam at the time may have done a lot to help put the movie in context. As such, when you watch this movie, the war itself is only a side issue. And you get the impression from watching this movie that it's not about the war, it's about the freedom to protest. And I don't know, maybe the freedom to protest is a noble enough sentiment to make a whole movie around. I think something got lost a little bit. Another thing that potentially gets lost in this film is the significance of any of the players are never really explained. And like I said before, at least 6 out of the 8 people in the Chicago 8 were celebrities at the time. They were well-known figures on the left. The courtroom trial contains a lot of omissions, and I know it's impossible to do everything in 2 hours, but there was a lot of rather juicy scenes that got left off. The testimony of Mayor Richard Daley, for example, that was some scene that had some conflict in it. That had some cinematic potential. They just cut that off. There's a whole bunch of stuff they got cut. Most of the celebrity witnesses who end up getting called to the Chicago 8 trial got cut. Now, with all that getting cut, it did confuse me a little bit about the stuff that they actually left in. Because some of the stuff they left in just seemed a little bit random. You're like, well, why is this in the movie? Why did they make room to include this? I don't know. I guess, again, I would just encourage people, if you're interested in this, to check out the actual trial of the transcript yourself. Sorry. Check out the transcript of the actual trial yourself. Read through it. It's completely fascinating. All that being said, it's not a bad little movie. Some parts of it were well cut together, and they generally did a good job of keeping the energy up. And they also had a good soundtrack, you know, a lot of very high adrenaline music. So hopefully this movie will catch the interest of younger people and make them more interested in activism or make history seem more exciting to them. One final comment. This movie was rated R. I think it was rated R because the F word gets said a few times. But really, this illustrates how broken the American rating system is. If a movie like Die Hard, one of the Die Hard series, Die Hard 4 I believe, can get rated PG-13, but a movie about people protesting and trying to end the war gets rated R just because of a few 4-letter words in it. Yeah, what does that say about our culture? Hopefully that R rating is not going to stop anyone from seeing this movie. I'm hoping that everyone who wants to see this movie is going to find a way to see this movie, whether they are legally 18 or not. But yeah, it's just a stupid thing by the MPAA to rate this movie R.